I met Lucy partly because I was such an enormous fan of this gorgeous book, When Breath Becomes Air. And I had just started this podcast called Everything Happens as a play of the glorious cliche, everything happens for a reason. And the joy of that first episode, it was my first episode ever taping, but we actually had to retape it because I was so deeply committed during the taping of it to just being Lucy's best friend. And it didn't make like an amazing broadcast. So I was like, tell me everything. Also, I love you. Do you love me? Can we live together? So, are we building something? But I think what's so lovely for me about this experience is I get a chance to talk to Lucy about some of the things that I've admired most about her and the contribution that this work has made. So, so I'm Kate, and she was forced to meet me because I'm an expert in the American prosperity gospel, the idea that God rewards people with health and wealth and happiness. And and my own memoir has kind of similar themes of love and loss and things that don't always work out. So I just wanted to start with Lucy, if you don't mind. Hey.
Hi.
Hey. So tell me about Paul. What did you love about him?
And I'm really glad to be here too. So my late husband, Paul Kalanithi, was a neurosurgeon who, so all our friends are super devastated that Paul's memoir is not funny, because Paul was a really funny person. And we've met in medical school, actually, and I knew that he was an intellectual thinker and a moral person, and then I realized that he had a fake mustache on his medical student ID, which is really gutsy. Like, that's pretty crazy. And he had been a comedy writer in college, and then I think was nervous when he was entering medical school that medicine was going to make him too serious or blunted or something. That's my theory anyway. So he whipped out this big, bushy, fake mustache and put it on his face and wore it in the ID, and then applied to be a neurosurgeon a few years later, and all of the supervising physicians who needed to write his letters of recommendation saw this ridiculous photo. But somehow he made it, became a neurosurgeon, and then when he was 36, started to lose weight and developed some really ominous symptoms, and then was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. And lived for 22 months, initially went back to work as a neurosurgeon, and then very fortuitously started writing and ended up writing the content for this memoir and died a little bit before it was published. So I've sort of been doing this posthumous book tour in Paul's stead, which has been very interesting for me as a physician, and also as a grieving person who has like society's permission to say Paul's name and talk about Paul, which is a total gift to me. I liked that guy.
Why do you think it was so important for Paul to write? I just, in my own, there was like an urgency to feeling like I could just kind of pour everything out. But you had this intense and beautiful witness of both his pouring his life into this words, and then you like shepherding it through this publication process. So, looking back, what do you think it was about writing that expressed something really true about what he was going through?
Oh yeah, so Paul was a voracious reader his entire life, and there was this really interesting moment where, he'd been having all these terrible symptoms. He's like a young neurosurgeon who doesn't have time to go to the doctor, and over this series of a couple of months, ended up losing 15 pounds, surprisingly, and developed a cough, and then had a chest x-ray with his doctor that showed really abnormal lungs full of nodules, which is like, you hope it's disseminated tuberculosis, and like, you're having a bad day if that's what you're hoping for, especially as a doctor. And he was admitted to the hospital for expedited workup of the symptoms, and when we went to the hospital, I took like the insurance card and fuzzy socks and like the things you take when you're going to be a patient, and he took a stack of books, which is really interesting. He took Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis and Being in Time by Heidegger, and a novel called Cancer Ward by Solzhenitsyn, and just dove back into reading. And he writes in the memoir how he pushed so hard to find out as much as he could about his prognosis and how long do I have left. And then ultimately he says, if you are seeking comfort in statistics. It's like trying to quench a thirst with salty water. And that's not where he ended up finding it. He ended up finding it by like trying to put words on it and trying to find other people's words about this experience of facing mortality and about suffering. And I think something about naming it and then like being a little bit at a remove to write and examine the experience ended up being fortifying and possible. You know, I think it was so intense that writing about it helped. And it's interesting because there's this whole field of narrative medicine now that's about drawing stories out of medicine and finding the humanity in what we do, patients, healthcare providers. Can I turn it back on you?
Oh, sure, yeah. Hey, oh, me, yes, right. I also wrote with the urgency of death. Yeah, and like, I think part of the weirdness of writing something that becomes then very public later is that there's this intense, there's an intense privacy to just like holding your life up to the light and then saying, because it's part of the why, at least it was for me, like what did my life mean? And like, was it going somewhere? And I was trying, and I wrote in order to try to be like pretty brutally honest with myself and my own presuppositions. But
her book is really beautiful, by the way. Bill Gates just recommended it in his, seems fancy, just like Aspen Street. It's also fancy. Our friend Bill Gates really likes it.
We're super close. What's so funny about like writing it was that I never thought, like, because I wrote an academic book before, which like a solid 200 to 300 people read, I think with great diligence, you know, and I never thought like, you know, I'm a really important person. I should really dig deep here and show people like what's really going on, like peek behind the curtain of this life. I was just like, oh, I don't know. I think the like scripts for being sick were so like thick and prohibitive, and I felt like all the real things I was thinking I couldn't say, and then I just tried to pour it into this other medium, which ended up being like all my secret, sometimes evil feelings. But I think when I read Paul's book, like one of the things that I feel like drives his life, and then the book is he was looking for a thing. Like he was really looking for this. He wanted an education in suffering. Yeah. And that's partly what I thought was so beautiful about it. Like he was trying to figure out what it means to like stand on the edge of things with someone and be afraid. Mm-hmm. Because there are things to be afraid of. I mean, otherwise it's just Instagram, right? And you know, like whatever. But like he's trying to get past at least the Disneyland of it. And that's partly been some of the joy of getting to know you and then getting to know Paul through this book is when you're on the outside of medicine, it can seem very like seamless, like kind of shiny and put together. And when I see how he was trying to build up this tolerance, almost like, and not to inoculate himself, right? Yeah. Is to like develop a relationship.
A homeopathic dose. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the questions I had when I was reading it, and I wondered too in your own practice, is like he describes so acutely that frustration he had when he's trying to get that education of what it means to be with and for suffering, but he keeps finding that there are all these obstacles. And then there's like, you know, you talk about Dr. Burnout. Yeah. What are some of the kind of reasons why people can't care at that level anymore?
Yeah. So Kate says this funny thing about the tone that healthcare providers or clinicians use, which she calls hostage negotiator neutral, which is like, it's like this, the tone where you're sort of at a remove, like there's like these real roles that you're inhabiting, the physician and the patient, instead of like two human beings sitting in a room holding on to each other. So I think there are a bunch of reasons that clinicians burn out, some of which are really similar to why lots of people burn out in lots of fields. And I think some of them are intrinsic to the job and just always will be that way, like really witnessing suffering again and again, or feeling this real moral obligation to be perfect and not to fail, which of course, you want to do with every patient every time. And then there are some kind of systemic aspects, I think, which are things like work hours and inefficiency and lack of autonomy and the electronic medical record, which is so fabulous and so terrible at the same time. And I think the systems issue stuff is just starting to be recognized. There's a lot of like resilience training in healthcare these days. And I heard it said so well. Someone said, if there's a canary in the coal mine, you can't just teach the canary to meditate. It's like, so great. It's like, oh yeah, if you're a medical student, you have so much grit already. Like, you just have to hold on to the grit. You don't have, you know. I think about burnout a lot. And I also think another thing is like, I think a lot of people go through this big fiery training and then end up not being the doctor they hoped they would be. You know, and one of the other deaths in Paul's book, besides his, is this beautiful surgeon who jumps off a building. And that was, that's important. You know, Kate said to me today, I learned partly through this book that I love doctors. I don't hate doctors. And I was like, doctors are so cute and sweet, you know, and but I think you're in a world that sort of expects you to be not that. And then you sort of go through and you're supposed to look so perfect. And then at a certain point, me in my own career, I was like, oh yeah, I can be a vulnerable person again. I used to like not let my patients see me looking something up. And now I'll say like, oh yeah, let's look that up together. You know, and I think you have to sort of regain your humanity. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because that moment, right, when it was at the moment in Paul's career where like he just kind of put it back together again, and then his friend dies terribly, and I imagine he thought like, oh, people are more fragile.
Yeah, sure.
All of us.
Sure. Although I will say, I don't think doctors' burdens are something that patients should need to forgive. You know, like, I don't think that's your job when you're a patient. I don't know.
Lucy has been super loving about, like, I haven't had always, like, an amazing experience with medicine. And it's, like, it's been hard to describe that sometimes because I don't want to look like I'm complaining when I'm grateful to be receiving care. But there's been moments where it was awful. So sometimes when you say things like, you don't have to forgive other
like,
people
I'm not.
for there, I'm like, okay, I'm still angry about it. It helps. It helps. Because you have all the, like, authority and fanciness of Dr. World for me. So,
can I ask you about where you are now? So I'm curious, and I'm sure people here are curious, about your academic expertise, which is the American Prosperity Gospel. It's been mentioned a few times what that is, but I'm curious if you can tell us what it is and why you study it. And then, and the reverberation into your own life, which is so interesting.
Well, sure, yeah, because academics only do like one thing, and my like one thing was the prosperity gospel. So I traveled around. I'm from Canada. I feel like Canadians always bring that in really early in. So I'm from Canada. Please remember that forever.
You have like the Canadian flag on your backpack.
Justin Trudeau, so beautiful. Like I'm from the very middle of Canada, and like learned about the prosperity gospel there when I found that there was this like Mennonite pacifist cheese-eating group of beautiful communitarians, that one of their own had become this motorcycle-driving, very slick, open-shirted prosperity pastor, and that he drove the motorcycle around on stage that his parishioners had given to him. And I was like, I need to learn everything about what is happening at this moment. So I was 18, and I was like hooked. So then I just started like traveling to, basically when you're a grad student, then you have nothing, but you just like take detours. So I took, maybe, in the end, I visited about a quarter of all megachurches, and I interviewed like everyone with a camera and a beautiful close-up. And at first it was kind of like, why hasn't anyone explained why Christians are now talking about money as an entitlement that they get from God? And then eventually it became a lot more sort of empathetic, where I thought like how, because all the caricatures of prosperity preachers are like, his and her Mercedes-Benzes, and, Jim Baker, who is still at this moment probably selling dehydrated foodstuffs to the elderly in rural Missouri. even after he wrote a book called I Was Wrong, I will have you note. But I just, I wanted to show like why it was so compelling that people wanted to ask God for everything. And so eventually, I spent about 10 years researching the American Prosperity Gospel and wrote this big history from the late 19th century onwards, which my husband has not even fully completed, even the audiobook. And I respect that. I respect that. Yeah, so that was kind of my one thing. I was really good at explaining why people expected to be happy. And then I got...
It's the American dream, right?
It was, and if you want the full, if I were here and I were giving a prosperity gospel lecture and I'd have a very compelling PowerPoint, it would be click 1, slide of American dream, / supernatural bootstraps. Slide 2, new thought, / Oprah. It's the belief that your mind is this powerful spiritual incubator that makes things happen. So when you speak words, then they come true, which was a late 19th century belief to the present. And it's usually the staple of any self-help.
But it also involves being good and true and pious, right? If you try hard enough,
sure,
good things will come to you.
Yeah, right? And it's reliant on the right kind of faith and the right kind of hard work. And I would have thought that's just I grew up really Mennonite and really Canadian, so we have incredibly low expectations of life. We're well, it'll probably be a little bit terrible, but we'll muscle through somehow. And then the second I got sick, I wasn't just devastated because it was so terrifying. It was almost I was morally outraged. What do you mean? I have a great personality. All these stupid things you believe about yourself. You're I'm somehow, I'm special somehow.
Right.
I'm
my future's ready to go.
Yeah, I'm sure other people suffer. Very sad for them. But right, and so so that's probably why I wrote the book too. Is I was trying to come to grips with what suffering felt like when it came and ripped my life apart. And that wasn't just sad because it was hard for me. It was the feeling that I was the bomb that goes off. I'm the thing that ruins everything. I'd have family members that would just stop eating certain things because they were worried it would give them the cancer that I got. And when you're the thing that happens to people, it really makes you feel you're on the other side of glass. So, oh man, I did not bring my own Kleenex factory.
I know. I was looking at
I'll just use the notes from your questions to slowly wipe my face. Yeah, it's gonna be great. So much dignity. But I guess too, it's kind of one of the things that which is the reason I was desperately trying to force our now actually real friendship, is in the face of suffering, you have this thing that you chose to do. You chose to say, your first words were I will never leave you. Mm-hmm. And you've taken on this bravery, I think, in your life that is, I think helps people think about both life and medicine in the same really tight little parallel track. And I was wondering if you could tell us about Katie and your decision. I think it was a real choice to live really bravely in the face of uncertainty, which is something I care a lot about.
Sure. So Paul and I had a child when he was sick. This is another, I'll just talk about this beautiful. So she's here in Aspen. So is my dad, actually. And it's dads never stop being dads. Today, last night we got a crepe to eat, and we split these 2 crepes, and he was you might want to eat this one second because it's a little bit spicy. And I was thanks, Dad. Yeah. I'm a 39-year-old doctor. Eat the crepe first. Our daughter Katie is almost 4, and she also has she's kind of Paul gave his parents a lot of trouble growing up because he was he was in charge of the direction of his own moral compass, and his parents were not. And I think I have that kid too. And, but yeah, I think the bravest thing, and I think this for Paul too, I think choosing to have a child during that time was a big deal. And actually, Andrew Solomon, the writer, is here, and I need to go, he's giving a presentation right now, and his book, Far From the Tree, convinced me that it was okay to have a child, despite the uncertainty and potential hardship that comes with that decision. So I gotta go find him. So during that time, Paul and I had always planned to have a child or try to have a child toward the end of his residency, when it kind of seemed like that's when things sort of lighten up. And he was diagnosed with cancer around that time, and we both sort of looked at each other and said, like, should we do this? Is this crazy? Yes, it's obviously crazy. But he said this really nice thing that taught me a lot, I think, about suffering and just life, and I think about it all the time, which was, we're having this conversation about what would it mean to have a child now, and I was very worried about him and said, your illness is progressing, and if we have a child and you're dying and you need to say goodbye to a child too, won't that make dying more painful? And he said, wouldn't it be great if it did? And it just I think there's so many things we do in our lives. Anybody who has a child is doing it. And different work we do, or even travel. There's so many things we do that we don't choose to do them because they're easy. We choose to do them because they're rich and meaningful and deep, and they deepen us and other people. And anyway, I think that really taught me something, or it crystallized something for me that I really care about. And I think you're probably doing that for a lot of people too. Not that your illness is supposed to be some kind of didactic tool for other people, but
learn from
Thank
me,
you.
all ye.
Yeah. But it's I think I'm not sure there's a point to suffering. Maybe you could talk about this. Except for that suffering, suffering connects you to all other human beings across time forever. And that I have found to be really wonderful,
Yeah, that's the cracked open feeling I feel.
Yeah.
Where now I feel more like human, but more, I don't know, weirdly, intensely loving toward
totally.
other people.
Yeah.
Because we're all just barely keeping it together.
Yeah, totally.
As it turns out.
Go team. Yeah. I'm wondering if you can tell us, you're one of these early beneficiaries of immunotherapy.
Yeah.
And your disease is not curable, but it's stable, and you're not dying. So you're in this very weird, uncertain, scary, liminal place.
Yeah.
That best case scenario you will be in forever.
Yeah, that's right.
For your whole life.
Yeah.
And the only certainty I think you will ever have is if things are not going well.
Yeah,
Otherwise, they are uncertainly going well.
Yes, totally. That's a new T-shirt. I really like that. I am uncertainly doing well.
Doing great today.
It's a very doing great asterisk. Yeah.
Asterisk.
Small print. All things being equal. Yeah.
And you write in your memoir about your grandmother, who is in this interesting other illness, and you talk about how you say, I stand in the in-between, and I keep thinking if my grandmother were here, she would understand.
Yeah.
Because I think that's a hard place to understand. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little about your grandma,
Sure.
if you don't mind. And then also, you are on, the cutting edge of cancer therapy. And, what is the view from the cutting edge?
Yeah,
what does it feel like to be standing on the edge?
Yeah, wow.
And the bottom line is, immunotherapy is working great.
Great, yeah, thank you.
But the only,
I'm
But I
serious.
was just going to say for everybody here,
exactly.
it's the studies don't go that far because it's so new.
Yeah.
And so it's just does it stop working when you're 80 years old, or does it stop working
In
this
18
year?
months. Yeah.
It's so intense.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I used to think the words cutting edge meant super best, awesome, bionic medicine. I thought give me that. I also thought that's what the words clinical trial meant. Where I was oh, give me the clinical trial. As opposed to the one that's well, we'll try this. I hope you like neuropathy. So, yeah. I mean, it's been, because at first, I'll answer the second question first because it is feeling fresh. I mean, it's just been you're so desperate, right? When you get the diagnosis, and it's just this huge chasm and you're trying to fill anything with it. Mm-hmm. And then you're just, at least for me, I'm an academic, I'm a reasonably smart person at one thing, but medical world was so entirely foreign to me. And that part was really frustrating for me because I was just like going, I was blind. I felt blind all the time. Like I'd see doctors standing in the row at the end of my, I'm recovering from surgery. I see 3 of them in a row, 1, 2, 3, and one of them is clearly more important, but I can't figure out which one. And why are they deferring to each other and not to me? What's happening? So it was constantly frustrating to not read the room, not understand the processes, and then not be able to read my own charts. Because I'm a Duke professor and I was in the Duke system, I would often get these notifications of how I was doing before they were explained to me. And often then even after they're explained to me, I still didn't understand. So I'm sitting there and my whole family is full of other humanities.
Like a CT scan result or something.
Oh my gosh, CTs. And I'm just like looking at it and I'm like, I'm a spaghetti bowl of cancer. And I have no idea what this means. And so we're just like weeping while Googling is like the saddest thing in the whole world. Like, the internet is so terrifying. Yeah, and so cutting edge for me usually felt that I had none of the landmarks by which to help navigate and even just to feel confident in my decisions. I didn't know, it wasn't just that it was so terrifying to be facing life or death, I just didn't even know how to adjudicate trust, especially when I hadn't built trusting relationships with doctors, because those were the same ones that I had begged to save me. Yeah. And then it was a bit late. So cutting edge has been terrifying. And that's partly why meeting other people and understanding that there's networks of people who are genuinely trying from a macro level to solve problems, I find incredibly therapeutic. I'm like, oh, really? You're lowering the colonoscopy age? Things I never thought I'd be grateful for and saying out loud? Everyone, get your colons checked. I'm so grateful for people who are trying to make interventions. It makes me feel like there was somebody looking out for someone like me who felt quite alone. But there are so many moments where, we're just at the edge of what we know. And the one person I knew like that was my grandma. She was really young when she was diagnosed with TB, and it was so incurable that they shipped her away right when she was just about to go to college. And they locked her up in this enormous sanitarium in rural Saskatchewan. They nicknamed Fort San because it looked formidable. And one year, there was this Italian doctor that had discovered a way of cutting out most of the lungs and did an entire sweep of sanitariums across Canada. And my grandma was, at a very young age, one of the sort of fortunate recipients of this brutal but life-saving therapy. And in the end, the person I met was one whose life had almost ended so early and then didn't. And then there was kind of this residue of her life where she just there were just things that had been taken from her, things that were irreplaceable. And there were times when that illness and its legacy robbed her of so many things. The ability to care for her children when she was too sick, and so my dad and his brother were farmed out to relatives. And every now and then her depression would be so debilitating that she would just kind of lock herself away. And I think of someone like that who's right at the edge of what she could know. And I know it's hard to understand how, I don't know, maybe just when you're young or a moron, but I think I had a lot of bounce before. I had a lot of bounce.
This is less bounce.
This is significantly less bounce. This is just meow. Yeah, I'm hitting the ground hard these days. And it teaches me a lot of I don't know, who is it who said today, was it Ari Johnson? He said the violence of the delay of medicine, the things you live into, because under my pretty dress is a whole torso that's all carved up, and a body I don't always recognize, and treatments that make me not feel like myself anymore. It does make you. Liminality is just a weird place to actually live. I live here, and I have I've set up a nice little tent, and I'm growing a garden, but I have to live it. Yeah, it's not my favorite.
It's so interesting about your grandma because it's she was locked up, and maybe she was going to be locked up forever, right?
Yeah.
And then she wasn't, but it's still so hard forever in all these different ways, and it's sort of you just don't know what's around the corner, whether it's good or bad. All of us forever, But I think you see that so much more acutely than you saw it before.
Yeah.
You
And
know?
like, I loved what my friend's aunt said. God bless old aunts of the world. They're like tiny wisdom, man. She was talking to my friend Lori, and she was just describing she'd had all of these moments of like life-threatening illness where something really terrible had happened and then not quite. And then at the end of her very long life, she said, man, looking back, I just would have not have had any idea what to be afraid of. And I think that's exactly right. Like, we have to all keep marching forward into the abyss, you know, and then hoping that there is like always just a little more space for us to stand in the midst of uncertainty. I was going to ask you to, because you started saying favorite things that Paul has said, and some of them are my very, very favorite. And wouldn't it be great if it did? Is gone down in the history books of Kate as like one of my very favorite things ever said. You had a couple other things that like Paul said that helped shape your view of suffering.
Yeah, there are just a couple really nice things that Paul said when he was sick one was, so the first day Paul was diagnosed, I said to him, I will never leave you. And the thing he said back to me was, I want you to remarry after I die. And it's so intense to think about saying that to your spouse. But in that little one sentence are all of these beautiful things. It's like, I'm having the worst day of my entire life, and I'm thinking about you. And I'm thinking about you independent of me, like this other whole person who will exist even when I don't. And I care about that too, which is just like the most beautiful thing. And then also he's sort of implicitly saying, I'm going to acknowledge what's really happening to me, and we're going to talk about it. Like, just said it right away. And that was so helpful to me and so freeing and lovely. And then he said a really nice thing another time, among many, where, being two doctors, we talked through all these logistics of his illness and trying to figure out how to navigate the health system together. Which even being doctors was rocky at times. And I said, we should do your advance directive. And he said, we should do your advance directive. And I was like, touche, we should. So we did those. And then we talked a lot about how, I'm really interested in end-of-life care and how, the end of our lives in the American healthcare system can be traumatic, and families can have PTSD from witnessing healthcare, and a relatively large proportion of people receive some care that they didn't, that was felt excessive or unwanted. And it's really hard to navigate, like, what to say no to and what to do. And Paul could tell, and this was so interesting, that I felt this real responsibility to like be his advocate and be the durable power of attorney and navigate what was what. But we know that that can be tricky, and you're acting with incomplete information. And what if you make a decision on behalf of somebody that you end up feeling like didn't fit them or whatever, like going on life support or not or whatever. And he said, I just have to tell you something. Whatever happens to me on the last day of my life, just do your best. And maybe it's going to be okay, and maybe it's not. But really, I can tell you already, as long as you did your best, you did a good job. And the last day of your life is not the sum of your life. The sum of your life is the sum of your life. And I was like, what a nice gift and a nice thing to say. So those were really helpful to me.
That means I get to follow up about the thing that was so. Lucy's been talking me into all kinds of things, like that palliative care is awesome.
Yeah.
Which, like, you've been like giving me quite the education about like the beauty, I think, of palliative care. Because I struggle a lot with that language, because what it sounds like to me is always like surrendering too much ground. Because I'm defined by my obsession with like control. I got this. I will earn my way out of this. Let me audition for the part. I swear I'll get the role. Please save me. And your imagination for palliative care. So tell me what you love about palliative care.
Okay, so there's so many misconceptions about palliative care. People say, like, what advice would you give a family going through something hard? It's just like, ask for a palliative care team. So people hear palliative and they think it means dying, or they think it means giving up.
Yeah.
And I just want to clear up these misconceptions, including for you. They're so amazing. It doesn't exclude your other care. which might be curative or have curative intent or be very intensive. And you're allowed to have them as your specialist team in addition to the other ones. And then in a Venn diagram of palliative care, hospice, which is for somebody who's dying and has a 6-month prognosis, is this teeny tiny little subset. So you could have a palliative care team because you have Parkinson's or you are on dialysis or literally anything you choose that's a health problem that's hard on you or your family in terms of symptoms or coping, or you need help making thorny medical decisions. And their whole deal is that they're experts in quality of life. And so they ask you real questions about who you really are and what you really want, and then how do you tailor your medical care to get that, and is that possible? So I actually feel like they give you more control because they help you ask all these questions and get at what you really want. And people hear palliative, it's like whoever did their branding is like they need a reboot. And I actually think if you could redesign healthcare like from the ground up, it would start with that. It would be like, who are you and what do you want? At your service, how can we help you get this stuff out of your life? And they're amazing. So, and you don't have to be dying anytime, literally at all, anytime soon, ever. They're like experts in quality of life. And the only reason they exist, and they popped up like a couple decades ago, is because it was missing in healthcare. So they said, this group of people said, we're going to make a new specialty that exists alongside the other ones. It's great. They're great. They're awesome.
I'm for it.
Great. All right.
I'll work on the
follow up.
reboot. The it might be okay team. We'll pop in.
I mean, really, they're not, it's not like, you can have them concurrently with any other specialist forever.
As opposed to beginning with the idea that it's the fork in the road.
Let's transition to palliative, which is a thing people say, but it's actually a misnomer. Yeah. They're great. They also really focus on symptoms in a specialized way. We had a palliative care team, and they had Paul fill out all these really specialized symptom scales to help tailor all the medications. They put him on a stimulant so that he could focus on writing the book, because they found out that was really important. And then I said, you're having 7 out of 10 nausea all the time? I'm your wife, and I didn't even know that. And they uncovered all this really important stuff about how he's feeling. They were great. Yeah.
Man, I have found that experience really tricky, when I'm filling out forms. I mean, because this ended up being weirdly related to the research I was doing in prosperity gospel, where we feel like we always have to be optimistic. But those pain scales I thought were supposed to be so that there's some kind of honest exchange. And I have found that 8 out of 10 times someone uses the word at least with me in that scenario. I'll be like, I have a 5 on 10 of this kind of pain. And they're like, well, at least you smirk. I'm just like, stop socializing me out of honesty. Because it was so hard to find those places where I could say, where I could honestly communicate a couple things. One, I am afraid. Oh man, right before a surgery, I am afraid. Who do I tell that to? Or, I find that it's just so many people, which I'm actually really good at identifying people who go to a prosperity church who belong to the healthcare system by sticky tabs around their monitors. If there's just today is your day to be a champion, then I'm like, not you. Today is not necessarily my day to be a champion. You can be for the recovery squad, but not the pre-surgery team. Yeah, I find it really hard to find places of honesty about fear to even let that agency come in.
Can you build on this a little bit? Because I know, so the appendix to your memoir, and then also one of your big goals in life is to change the way people talk about suffering. So can you tell us about that mission, and also for people who have a friend going through a hard time, what are the helpful things to say, if it's not at least?
Right, yeah. Someone said at least to me before I got into the MRI machine 2 days ago. At least.
At least what?
At least you're at Duke Hospital. I was like, we're the same age, and I'm getting into the MRI machine. Let us simmer down on the perspective, friend. Amber. So mad. Yeah, well, like, because my background, right, is in, like, religious beliefs around this kind of, like, anything is possible. Yeah. But you're right about it being a part of the American dream. It is so infused our casual language around how we encourage one another that it can be really exhausting for the person who's suffering. Because it always makes it seem like we're supposed to be gaining perspective at some point, like learning a lesson, teaching a lesson. So I started thinking about people. So right when I first got diagnosed, I was trying to come to grips with that, like, oh, maybe I'm not special. And then I had a lot of private feelings, which I wrote down, but then emailed it to somebody's editor at the New York Times, not thinking they would publish it, just thinking, like, at least I tried. And then they published it. And then I didn't think it through and didn't, like, change any of my, for instance, very easy to access personal information. So I just got, like, thousands and thousands and thousands of letters. Yeah. And so I think in that first 6 months,
and this is an essay called Death, the Prosperity Gospel, and Me.
Yes.
And it's super beautiful. It's amazing.
Thanks. People also didn't like the ambiguity of the ending when I was like, rah, 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 and they were like, you should be so. So I thought the point of the piece was to say, like, could we all just simmer down on our obsession with certainty? And then people were like, I'm so sorry you feel uncertain. Let me give to you the explanation for why you are suffering here in this email. So, you know, like, weirdly, so from my research and then just from, like, the sort of intense feedback I've gotten, like, thousands of letters from people, both explaining their own suffering and then mine. And you know, so there's, like, the whole gamut of, like, religious explanation, like, wages of sin is death, you know, and that variety, in which is always, like, an old man from Indiana.
People are writing to tell you.
Yeah, why this, like, 35-year-old is crying over leaving her kid. And it's like, thanks, Gary. You know, like, Gary wanted me to know that I for sure deserve it. And I was like, Gary. Yeah, and then there was a lot of, like, well, you think that's bad, try. You know, I'll never forget this lady was like, and I found out I was adopted at 60. And I was like, that sounds really upsetting. But also I have stage 4 cancer. You know, like, they don't have to be, like, it's not the Olympics, you know? So, yeah, that was hard. Minimizers have been rough.
Tell us about that.
Well, so, yeah, I mean, people who are always who think that what you are struggling with is a lack of perspective. So you would just suffer less if I were to just compare you with someone else. And just, like, reach inside your pain and help you sort of make adjudications. And, like, the problem is, of course, is that I just, like, I'm never really looking for an explanation for why this is happening to me. I'm just, like, lonely or sad or scared or just, like, wanting food that people give me that I didn't cook, you know? So it's, like, the very basic gifts of presence and community and, like, love, because that fundamental exhaustion I experienced that both I studied and then lived into was that people didn't see me anymore, that I was a problem to be solved, and that they were so desperate to explain me. And every single time I always felt like, as much as they were, I mean, a lot of it is born of love, but it's like they see that ugliness that separates us, like this awful cancer that's threatening to take away, like, things that are beautiful and I can't live without. And then they just want to fill it. So they fill it with, like, teaching. Just so you know, I've recently watched this documentary, and I would very much like you to watch it right now. There's always a small country that is doing very well and has no cancer, and we should all move there and eat guava or whatever. It's always, like, essential oils or, you know.
Will you tell us about your friends? You have this friend, Ray Barfield.
Yes.
Who's a pediatric oncologist.
Yeah.
So he is used to sitting with pain.
Yeah.
Of course. And he's been a great friend to you.
Yeah.
And you write about it in your book, too. So will you tell us what you love about Ray?
Yeah.
Because my guess is he's a great doctor for some of the same reasons he's a great friend.
Yeah.
But you love what he's done for you.
Totally. And I will say that all the mistakes I just listed are typically people who love me and would give me a kidney.
Sure.
And also people who are trying to solve the problem of my pain. And they're usually really smart, so I don't understand why.
Well, nobody teaches
essential
us
oils
this, right?
is, like, such a big deal.
Yeah.
Like, everyone's
they're
running
trying,
a franchise.
like they're
yeah.
trying.
Yeah, because like everyone's ready to like
Yeah.
open the trunk of their life and just like give me whatever's in there. Yeah, and then I learned a lot through someone like Ray. Ray was like a colleague at the Divinity School. Like he taught philosophy or something rather, and I was teaching my like history of Puritans to megachurches courses. And then all of a sudden, I was like, oh my gosh, what's the rest of your life? Wait, you're a pediatric oncologist. Oh, that sounds really hard. So when I was right after my diagnosis, we were just really stunned, and none of us, we hadn't gotten to that place where you like can transform it into any kind of agency. We were just like, people were just like making soup for no reason. Like there was just like that sad exhaustion, like hum, you know. He came over and he like sat on my side of the bench outside, like he was on my team, and he just turned to face down my totally grieving parents with nothing but just like love. Like he didn't have access to my charts. He had no special information. He just sat there and he looked them in the eye and he said, "I'm so sorry. This is so awful." And like everybody was like really shocked just to have that thing said and named that doctors hadn't yet done with us, for us. And then he was like, "Look, we're in a weird place in cancer treatment, and we're just going to have to work on getting you from one good outcome to the next. But we have to give up on words like cured and words and perfect certainty. Like, we're in the gray zone, and the gray zone sucks. But like,
this is awful. Yeah.
yeah, this is awful." And also he brought alcohol, and I had like giant liver tumors, and I thought that was so awesome. He was just like pouring it. I was like, this is so compromising. It was so great. Yeah, I wasn't behind glass anymore. And the best people are so good at that. They realize that there's nothing special that they're going to bring, that they just love me. And even if they don't love me, they just like me or know about me, then they can do things like take me to the airport because I had to go to clinical trials in Atlanta, or make food, or babysit my kid, or like just do a thing so that this lifting this heavy weight doesn't feel so heavy anymore.
Yeah. I don't know where the question is inside this, but so we have very little control over anything in our lives in a way. We can control how we cope and how we treat each other. And that's why it's so crazy that like we're stealing each other's children these days. And I think in that particular thing, it's like I think about someone like Paul or you who would give anything to have years and years with your child. You know, and then this stuff happens in the news where it's like, whoa, that's a human-created problem. Yeah. And there's all these problems we can't fix, but like we can stop making them, or can we somehow fix them? And so there's that big human-created problems and tragedy, and like the problem of evil. Maybe your divinity, you can talk. Please explain the problem of evil. I can explain it, and I can fix it. So there's that. Yeah. And then there's like the airport, where like yesterday we're all in the airport. And the plane gets delayed, and everybody's like, "But I am going to Aspen, so I need to get where I'm going." And it's like, there's like, you know, easy problems to solve that are not a big deal that we get upset about, and other problems that are a huge deal. And I'm curious about how you relate to other problems in your life in a way, if it's different from the way you did before or not.
Yeah, well, and like with these macro level, like national issues, national tragedies that are not like just natural evil, like what we would say in religious, well, like hurricanes, natural evil, imprisoning children, not natural evil. It is, you know, now that I know how fragile I am and can't even like separate that from the way I know things, it's really hard to watch people participate or build systems pretending that like grand ideals that people can bear the weight of such grand ideals. It's hard to watch people get crushed in complicated machines that they could solve. I find it like hard to watch, just because the one I participate in the most are, because the second I got cancer, I got a part-time job, which is fighting with insurance companies and arguing over my complicated medical care decisions. And so I deal with complex institutions, sometimes run by evil robots, sometimes just run by tired people.
That's an interesting one, actually. Like, we have this huge problem to solve, and the system is making it harder every day. That's a great.
Because when I see those, because I'm an immigrant, I struggled a lot with immigration issues, and that was as a very privileged person. And so when I see complex machines churn up people, has felt, it's the sort of faceless, exhausting evil where everyone facing you is the person without power. And then you're just begging them to see you as a person. Please save me. Please save me. And you're always saying that to the person who usually just doesn't have any ability to do it. Makes you a little crazy. It honestly, like, not to just be totally honest, but like, it like takes something away. Like this fundamental feeling that your life is not paper, you know? It does sort of like make you feel transparent and everybody is, you know, permanent. But some of that's been like just the sheer number of cotton gowns I've been in recently. And I was like, I was wearing clothes 2 seconds ago, right? Like, this is not who I am. But I think all of us, like, when we're facing big machines or problems we can't solve, we're like, wait, I wasn't this person a second ago, was I?
Totally.
So it's been hard to like think of my life as having agency and durability when so often it doesn't feel like that's true. But it also makes me feel super guilty when I'm I get super annoyed at like, I'm a bad person. Like with really small things. Like I tried to process a direct deposit form the other day at my school and was unable to do so with an accountant named Wayne. And like, I know that I'm just like residually upset about life and death issues, but I'm like, Wayne? Like, I find I'm like just feeling really guilty about like my sheer rage at petty problems. Because you feel like when you're so inspired, you should feel inspirational all the time. And then you in fact do not feel inspirational like a fair bit of the time. So I don't know if you feel like that too.
You like take names.
Oh,
like
Wayne,
it's like
Amber.
Wayne and Amber. I mean, like,
yeah.
what to do?
Yeah, there'll be a reckoning. I hope so. Yeah, I'm becoming more deeply religious in that sense. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I do wonder though, like having taken this book from a beautiful person to a beautiful book and then to a message. Do you find that it like cemented in you the ability to choose things, like to choose things that are good for their own sake? Because that's what I get from this book. And that's what I get, honestly, from whenever you talk about doctoring, is like you will bring your full humanity into it. And it has its own, it's like what the language people use for vocation. It's its own calling. Did that help set a course for you?
What do you mean exactly?
You don't have a job. You have a calling. You.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Did this give you a calling, do you think?
Sure. I mean, the thing it did for me, a whole bunch of things. Initially, I was just propelled by sadness and grief and love. So it was like, I will do anything for this book. And it came from like a totally raw place. And it felt so urgent, like choosing the cover for the book on Paul's behalf. It was like, we worked so hard on it, and I was like, it needs to be timeless and masculine and classic, but not trendy. And I just was like, it must be a thing. And initially it was like all lowercase letters, but that was too trendy, so then they changed it. And then, so I used to prior to Paul getting sick, I'm a general internist. And I really care about the places in medicine where the moral case and the business case intersect. So it's like primary care, end-of-life care, clinician burnout, these certain areas where there's a moral imperative to make them better, and it's also fiscally responsible. And I care about both of those things. And if you're going to make a moral case, you oftentimes have to tie a budget to it. So then it's like, great, let's go there. And then Paul got sick, and now I actually talk about a lot of the same things, but in a personal, soulful way. And it turns out stories really matter. And so it's been very propelling and helpful to enter this national conversation, in particular about end-of-life care, with professional and personal chops, both. And it feels really good. It feels like using all pieces of myself at one time. And then I'll never stop being a doctor. I'll never stop practicing medicine. It's very propelling.
Because I think before my drama, I would have just been pretty happy to be just a professor who teaches like the mega churches to Puritans course. I would have been fine. Puritans are kind of interesting. Their lives were very depressing. But I think like this whole thing taught me something that feels like it draws me into something bigger.
Sure. Yeah.
Not because I'm
Yeah.
special. I'm over that belief.
Yeah.
But I do think that there is like a thinness to the way that we account for others' fragility. And that there is this, like, the great American civil religion is
Yeah.
our belief that optimism
Yeah.
fuels all things,
Yeah.
papers over any difference, bulldozes
Yeah.
through every obstacle, structural,
Yeah.
racial. I mean, like, no one,
Yeah.
an individual will in this country is supposed to always make a
Yeah.
way.
Sure. Yeah.
And then there's everybody else.
Yeah, it's like the prosperity gospel is everywhere. Can you tell us about what it's like to raise a child in the midst of this, and what you're teaching your son that maybe is different from what you would have, or just like in general, what
Yeah.
you feel like with your son who's 4 and
A total narcissist. Yeah, love him. Yeah, I think I thought my job before was to create the hamster bubble around him and say, like, we live in it here, and my job is to give you interesting hobbies and life enrichment and like a vague but important sense of the problems of the world.
Yeah.
But it's my job to love you and let you grow in this like perfectly insulated little ecosystem. And then I became aware that the worst thing in his life might be me. And that like almost broke my heart. So I was like, okay, I need to like I need to reevaluate. So I think what I realized in all
how
of
old was
this.
Zach when you got diagnosed?
Oh man, he like was still 1.
He was little. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah,
now
and
he's
all
4.
my
Okay.
strongest memories of like when I was in the hospital and I couldn't pick him up because the surgical
Yeah.
scars.
Or like I'm sure you wondered whether he would remember you, or
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
it was just like the helplessness
Yeah,
was
yeah.
like exhausting,
Yeah.
exhausting.
Yeah.
So I think what I learned for myself and then also for Zach was, I think my job is not to pretend that I can either use certainty or determination to solve every problem, but that if I could show him that the purpose of life is not to avoid pain, but to find a way through, then I can just raise the most compassionate softie in the world.
It's great. It's great. I think I
Oh
agree.
yeah, what? No.
Yay, thank you.
Who needs all of these? Thank you. Thank you.
We should have gotten
Industrial
bourbon
grade,
up here too. I agree with that. I think I used to think, oh, and then you try to raise a happy child, and now I'm like, no, you try to raise a resilient child. You know, like,
Yeah, brave.
Yeah.
Brave in the face of reality.
yeah.
Yeah.
We talked earlier about, there's these big things that I think are important for your family to know about you, and even your doctors to know about you. And Atul Gawande has done this big project about the fundamental questions to ask somebody with a serious diagnosis, and it's things like, what are your fears? What do you hope for? What are the trade-offs? What are you unwilling to give up? And I think we talked about that today, and I said, what are the things you don't ever want to give up? And you only talked about Zach.
Yeah.
You said, like, I would put up with a lot of suffering to be there for Zach. And you also talked about how you don't want him to suffer. Like, you yourself would make trade-offs that would allow him to suffer less, whatever that might mean. I thought it was so lovely. I mean, it's just so I think it's really important to know your own North Star. It's just so clear that little.
Yeah, and then if fragility is a given, if we're all, paper sometimes, then the point then is to choose between competing loves, right? It's like, I've loved this life. I'm loving this life, but like there are other things that I would trade a lot of things for. And thank God they happen to be the things that I chose in the first place. So, well, I know we kind of have to go.
Yeah, that's a good.
Thanks for letting me cry
Thank
here.
you.
I was grateful to be with you all.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yay.